Just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Yasmin Kera and I'm the Marketing and Outreach Manager at WEP Clinical. I'm excited to be bringing you this second webinar in our three-part webinar series exploring the decentralized clinical trial model. As many of you will know, we held our first webinar about a month ago in which we explored the patient experience in decentralized clinical trials. And today we're going to shift our focus and look at the sponsor and how companies can benefit from this clinical trial model. We have two wonderful speakers who are going to walk us through the content today, and they'll speak for about 30 minutes, and we'll leave 10 minutes at the end to answer some audience questions that were sent over in advance. What I will do to get us started is just give you a brief overview of our companies, because there's two company names being used and we don't want there to be any confusion. So WEP Clinical is a healthcare services provider that helps connect patients around the world with much needed treatments. And over the past 10 years or so, we've been doing this predominantly through our pre-approval expanded access programs and post-approval named patient programs, as well as our market access and clinical trial sourcing activities. And recently, through the acquisition of the second company, Wren Healthcare, we've now been able to add nursing services to this list of activities. And Wren Healthcare is made up of a great team of highly skilled and highly experienced clinical nurse specialists who conduct at-home healthcare services for CROs, sponsors, and study sites. And as Wren is now a WEP Clinical company, our two speakers with us today on this webinar are the Directors of Nursing at Wren, Teresa Flogel and Daniel Campbell. And what I'll do is I'll pass it over to them so that they can introduce themselves and walk us through the content. So Teresa and Danielle, do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Yasmin. It's really lovely to be on today to get to meet everybody. So thank you very much for dialing in. So I'll just give you a quick overview of who I am and what leads me to be in front of you all today. So for those of you I don't know that are here with us, I'm Danielle Campbell, and first and foremost, I'm a nurse. I've worked in a number of different roles within my career, which have led me into this position now that I hold of Director of Clinical Research and Oncology, which is a title I love to have because it encompasses my two biggest passions. So throughout my career, I've been able to be fortunate enough to work within those specialist areas of interest in research and oncology. I've spent time working for National Health Service here in the UK for different cancer centres for patients throughout their whole journey from diagnosis, treatment to the end of life. I've also worked within the private sector running home health solutions for oncology services across the country, as well as working for a global pharmaceutical company before joining the Wren Healthcare team. And now I have the pleasure of setting up, implementing and overseeing our home health solutions to support the decentralised clinical trial model.
Hello, and I'm Teresa Flogel. I am also a nurse for a lot longer than Danielle, but that's not necessarily an advantage on my part. I direct the nursing services team here in the United States who provide decentralized clinical trial nursing support to sponsors and CROs across the entire 50 states. I've had, as I said, many years of nursing work, both in clinical arena and industry settings. And I've also have pretty extensive research experience in clinical and academic settings. My nursing research focus has always been patient-centered care and clinical outcomes assessment. And most of my clinical research activities have been conducted doing through in-home patient visits. So this whole move into decentralization and moving into patient homes to meet them where they're best met is really exciting to me. And I'm excited to share our discussion with you today. With that, we always have an agenda. As Yasmin introduced earlier, we will focus on this webinar on the sponsor and site benefits when utilizing mobile nurses in decentralized clinical trials. Our agenda begins with an overview of some of the challenges sponsors and sites may encounter in traditional clinical trials. We'll reintroduce briefly the DCT model, discuss mobile nursing solutions to support sponsors and clinical sites, and finish up with some stories of mobile nursing implementation to support the decentralized clinical trial. And of course, at the end, we're planning to have time for a few questions. So we know that patient recruitment, retention, and adherence and budgeting areas for all of these are crucial determinants of success or failure of a clinical trial. But of course, we've got a few facts. Globally, over 80% of clinical trials don't meet their recruitment timelines. And over half of trials that terminate report the primary cause of termination to be low participant accrual. And still, inclusivity numbers in clinical trials are very poor. At the start of this decade, according to the 2020 FDA Drug Trials Snapshots Summary Report, industry-sponsored clinical trials for that year included only 8% Black and 11% Hispanic participants, which is significantly different from the 12.5% and 18.5% of the US population for those groups. These, in our first webinar, we highlighted patient-centric challenges that contribute to those statistics I just shared, such as the ones listed here. But sponsors and sites also face challenges related to patient care and research in traditional clinical trials. Challenges such as finding qualified site locations and the appropriate location of those clinical sites. As sponsors depend on a large central site or managing multiple brick and mortar sites, they face the potential for high costs for staffing with personnel who can perform both routine healthcare and be able to provide those research activities. And attracting patients to enroll in trials that are hard to access is always a low win situation. We automatically think of rural patients' distance to a clinical site, but don't discount the urban patient who still has to navigate city streets or public transportation to attend a trial visit at a large or major medical center. That location barrier can prevent flow of information, period, block the awareness, or inhibit the patient's ability to participate. Sponsors face increasing competition for limited patient pools also, especially for certain conditions such as rare cancers, and rare diseases, multiple sclerosis, things like that. So it's important for sponsors to be able to have the farthest reach possible for their patient pool. Clinical sites also have face challenges in the conduct of traditional trials, such as hiring and training the right staff for a constantly dynamic environment, balancing priorities between medical care and research, scheduling appropriate staff to conduct sporadic research activities. All of those things can be burdensome. Also, don't forget capacity limits at the site. They also may be a challenge. This could potentially turn into excessive wait times at clinical sites that are juggling multiple health priorities, which in turn adds to that area on the right about patient challenges with travel and time constraints. And of course, we certainly know concerns about infectious processes, COVID being the most relevant lately, or the next infection control crisis can inhibit clinical sites to meet the needs for clinical trial patients. So what are the consequences of all these challenges? Low rates of recruitment and retention have a detrimental effect on important, in my category, scientific validity, but also financial viability of studies. Increased trial time is the #1 reported challenge by companies, and lack of qualified personnel is the second, hence the challenges that I highlighted on the last slide. While adding more trial participants is always a site burden to think of. Additionally, these challenges can delay approval and delivery of investigational products to market, and thus to the patients who desperately may need the drug, and affecting their outcomes, which is our priority. So how can the decentralized clinical trial help mitigate these challenges and support sponsor and site experience and outcomes? Decentralized clinical trials facilitate conducting studies outside the boundaries of traditional clinical sites. This approach can broaden trial access to reach a larger number and potentially more representative patient population. As we discussed in the previous webinar, taking the trial to the patient supports retention and adherence. Certainly, a decentralized clinical trial model doesn't have to be an all or nothing, but rather a blend of activities that can support both the patient and the sponsor and clinical sites. Our focus today is just that, the activity of mobile nursing visits to support sponsors and sites conducting clinical trials.
So what we wanted to do is start to think about how do we even start to implement these decentralized nursing solutions and home health solutions into what is the traditional clinical trial model. So throughout this slide, I'm not going to read particularly what's on these points, but I'm going to talk through the points that are key. So the first thing is all of this pre-trial activity and training that needs to take place, and planning is key. A home health solution that's going to work will work closely with the sponsor or CRO to understand those exact needs of the study and the exact needs of the patient that's taking part in the study. So all of this pre-trial work is just as important as actually when the implementations happened and the patient visits are starting to take place and you've got people recruited and enrolled. So once that understanding's there, then it's important that the correct documentation is written and data collection processes are in place before we then start to think about then training on the protocol for project managers that are going to lead and support from the home health perspective for the home health visits that are going to take place, to be able to then roll that out to the home health nursing team that's going to be working on the study. Then pre-visit, moving into the next phase, it's looking at the nurses that need to be identified that are going to meet the exact needs of the study itself and the needs of the patient and those specifications. So again, that close working relationship with the study site needs to begin at this point. So that pre-work is done with the sponsor, and then we're moving on to the site to understand the exact patients that are going to be referred, the numbers of patients that are going to be referred through, and the best ways of communication. And I think communication is key. You'll probably be sick of me saying the word communication throughout the next 15 minutes or so, but it really is the most important thing we can do, because it all goes to help building that trusting relationship to ensure that we know that patients and sponsors are going to get the best outcomes of studies. Because, if we're having transparent and open communication throughout, that's how we know and everybody can keep abreast of exactly of what is going on. So once we've identified nurses, it's important that that training is completed in a timely manner, and that we make sure that GCP is fundamental throughout all of this as well. So there'll be training certificates, there'll be delegation of authority that needs to take place, and potentially the meeting of the mobile nurse site with the clinical trial site centre, so they can understand the nurses that are going to be out there visiting these patients and carrying out the activities that are going to be pivotal to the study. The other thing outside of the actual physical nursing activity is the logistics around the visit, and where our project management teams are really important, and that integration when looking at the direct to patient and direct from patient shipments, and making sure that's organised and shipment plans are built to ensure that that is meeting the needs of the study and the sampling and the central laboratories and the site and the patient and the nurses. It's really important that that communication piece, again, you can see it there, having to spin so many plates and so many people being involved. It's absolutely key that that is all done pre-visit. So then the actual visits themselves, anybody that's heard me speak before about decentralized solutions will know that I talk about how we get asked the question of how large is the boot of your nurse's car? Can they really do all of this stuff that you're saying that they can do when they're out on a visit? And the answer is yes. Other than being able to squeeze an MRI scanner potentially in the back of the car, that might mean that the seats might need to come down or something. Everything else can be carried out. So it's then making sure that the nursing team are there ready to carry out the sample processing, administer IMP of any kind, complex IV infusions, simple adherence and checking of diaries of oral medications, diary reviewing, adverse event monitoring, vital signs. That's key, but as well as, again, that direct communication straight from the patient's home back to site if required. And the project management team are pivotal throughout that home visit process, and being a point of contact for the nursing team as well as the site team as well as the sponsor if that communication piece needs to happen whilst the home visit is being carried out. As well as obviously carrying out all those activities, the source documentation is key, that is carried out in a timely fashion whilst the nurse is there with the patient doing the visit. And then after the visit, those post-visit activities are just as important as all the stuff that's led up to it. It's making sure that the source documentation is good quality, that it's being checked before it's sent into site to be reviewed, sending it in securely, the shipment of the all of the IMP that's going to be returned or the samples that have been processed is being tracked. And that is all done by a good project management team in a good home healthcare organisation to alleviate some of that burden from the project management team, from the site or CRO or sponsor that would otherwise be having to carry those activities out. And also ensuring that communication post-visit is there between site and sponsor to make sure that everything's been achieved effectively, that there's satisfaction from all parties, that all of the needs of the study and the protocol are being met in an appropriate fashion. So that was a bit of a top level of the things that are needed to be in place, but actually what can we do to put sponsors, sites, CROs at the centre of home health? And if you dialed into our previous webinar, you'll maybe be familiar with the setup of this slide. And in the last slide, in that circle in the middle, we had a chap, I affectionately called him Brian, as our patient, and we spoke about how patients are at the centre of everything that we do. But hopefully what I can now do is bring to life the fact that we can make the sponsor or CRO that's centric as well in what we're doing with delivering these services. So firstly, the effective project management is key. And I know I started to talk about that in the previous slide that was on as well, but what you'll notice is I'm going to keep talking about this communication piece and you will be sick of it, but this project manager needs to be a key point of contact for the site and for the nursing team and for the CROs and for the sponsors, and know exactly what is happening on a day-to-day basis. And knowing that we can really understand from that one point of contact the needs of all the parties involved to make this study a success. It means that they are in charge of implementing activities, of monitoring the activities that are taking place, and they're starting to build that trusting and effective working relationship as that central point when we're looking at implementing these home health services for decentralised trials. It also includes that understanding of all of the logistical support in shipments and the planning that goes around that, and making sure that burden, like I said, is alleviated. There's any of my colleagues that might be on the call that are used to working with couriers and packaging and shipping samples across the world, you know those challenges that exist. So anything that a good project management team can do to alleviate some of that time burden and stress burden and the things that give us all grey hairs is absolutely pivotal. And then we think about education. Education is key, and it is still a piece of work that needs to take place to educate the world on the benefits of home health implementation. And I suppose that's part of the reason that we're here today. And hopefully everybody is now starting to see that it can work in the best interests of the patients. But as a home health provider, it's important that sites are educated on what can be done for studies at home. I think sometimes there's still a bit of fear about what can and can't be done. What am I going to get back from the nursing team? What source data will I receive? Am I still going to get my samples on time? Are we going to get the reports back to complete all of the documentation that's required? But it's important that we work to remove that burden. And again, it all comes back to that communication and the trusting relationship that needs to be built. And part of that education piece is to support sites in utilising these services, giving them the better ability to be able to recruit and retain patients in the study. Like Teresa spoke about those challenges earlier, if sites can understand the benefits that are there, it helps to advocate for those services and support patients to have the additional choice to take part in studies as a home health solution. Then we look at feasibility. Maybe this is the first point I should have discussed, but again, the earlier that home health and decentralized solutions can be implemented into protocols, the better. So a good home health provider should be able to support sponsors when it comes to looking at feasibility of what can be done for patients at home, what burden can be lifted from sites, what can be done to make things more inclusive for patients. And if that's written in early on into protocols, it makes it much easier than trying to implement it into a study as a fix of an issue. We've had times, particularly throughout the pandemic, where patients have been unable to attend hospital, or staff may have been redeployed out of research units from, oncology studies or rare disease studies to working on COVID-19 studies, or even being redeployed into intensive care units. And that lack of capacity then meant challenges for patients being able to access their treatment and data still to be collected. And it was much more challenging to have to implement that as amendments throughout the study and work on that on a study that's already going. Whereas if that had been built in from the beginning, that hybrid way of working would have been a much easier thing to slide into, both for the sponsor and for the site and for the patients as well. And it's interesting when those things happen, patients often don't want to then go back to the traditional way of having to travel back into the site again. So our patient satisfaction is key. I think I've spoken a lot about communication already, but that integration with all the teams is so important. And I know it sounds cheesy, but a good home health provider should be an extension of the team. They shouldn't be seen as another vendor or another person that's contracted to do an activity. It should be part of a true centric study team. There should be people at the end of the phone being responsive, and that generally boils back down to a key project manager and that one point of contact. But it's not waiting for days for an email to come back. It's picking up the phone and saying, okay, this has been a challenge previously, how can we overcome this? Or we're working on the study and the home visits, we may be considering them, or this was a challenge last time, or this patient has given us this feedback. And it's being human at the end of the phone and being able to be adaptable and rapidly flexible at changing where those needs need to be met. And then we look at the timely source data collection and reporting. Reporting is key. We all know that when home visits are taking place, the site can be updated instantly from the nursing team through telemedicine, picking up the phone if there's an adverse event reported, and it allows for that real world information coming in from patients. Source data is all completed at the time of a visit for patients, sent back immediately to project managers for review, and it inevitably gets back to site within 24 hours, but most of the time before that. And any adverse events are reported immediately to the PI or a designated individual. There's also access to any airway bills, any shipment tracking, it's provided. So it's a snapshot for every party involved in that study to have all of the information required to ensure the visits and the study is going to take place smoothly. So some of the benefits, I think Teresa has the hard job at the beginning of talking about the challenges, and then I can start to come in and do the positive bit. But as I said, Teresa spoke earlier about the challenges of having, to have large numbers of sites. Implementing a decentralized clinical trial service and home health solutions can reduce that. It reduces that the amount of institutional review boards that are required. It helps to reduce site costs. It helps to expand out into those rural areas and support our patients.
And I came across a study a few years ago by Summer and colleagues in Contemporary Clinical Trials Communications Journal, that they did a study treating patients with back pain, and they had a traditional clinical arm and a home visit arm, and they compared completion rates, and they found that only 60% of the patients enrolled in the traditional model completed the study versus 89% completion patients in the decentralized model. And again, the home visit for the remaining visits throughout the rest of the year of this length of clinical trial was the nursing piece for the DCT arm. And so again, comparing 60% completion to 89%, one study, but still very exciting information to share. Recruitment time also, I'm sorry, Daniel. Recruitment time also, when, again, going back to not just communication between sponsors and sites, but for advertising for patients recruitment. When patients have a better understanding of what it will take for them to participate in clinical trials, there are studies showing that recruitment times have been reduced by up to 25%, a quarter of the time reduced in recruiting the allotted number of clinical trial patients into a study, based on a survey of sponsors who were implementing a few DCT components, that again, time is money. So reducing that recruitment time supports budget.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing to hear those statistics. We see it in real life, but it's amazing to see it written down, isn't it? So the other thing, I just spoke about reaching that rural population and the underserved populations. We see that massively when we're able to support in a decentralized model. You know, we've got real life experience of treating patients that may have been 4 or 5 hours away from their trial site by distance. And I think, Teresa, you also made the point earlier of the patients that might live in an urban area. Any of you that have the joy of being in London, you know that traveling 2 miles can take you 2 hours sometimes. So that is a real burden that if we can lift that from patients, it must only go to help to reduce, you know, to increase retention, sorry. And then there's also knowing that patients that have this home health solution have the dedicated one-to-one time with the nurse, which has its own benefits. You know, I'm going to speak in the next slide about some of the real life experiences that we've had, but one-to-one nursing is not to be frowned upon.
Yeah, and I'll finish up, and again, not talking about money because patients are the center of everything that we do with nursing, but you have to be able to treat them in the clinical trial. And in order to do that, you've got to stay in budget. And so just a final comment on costs. I came across another pharma survey that found using lower cost and hybrid outreach facilities and in-home visits and testing could reduce their per trial cost by up to 16%. So certainly effective processes with DCT model components.
So, you know, we've spoken about what we think the challenges are and what the evidence says the challenges are, and a bit about what the evidence says the benefits are for home health solutions. But what do we see in practice? The first thing we see is continuity of care for patients and continuity of the information being reported. And that continuity, often with the patient, encourages adherence and reporting. If a patient can build that therapeutic relationship with a nurse or 2 nurses, if required, to make sure we have a backup in place, and they're visiting each time, they become much more activated in their care. They know that they're sort of accountable to that practitioner. And I know if Teresa was coming to visit me every other week to make sure that I've completed my patient diaries and my patient reported outcome questionnaires, I'm going to make sure I've done it. I don't want to be in trouble from Teresa when she comes round, but it's I jest, but that's really key. And that means that effective and complete information is reported back to sites and sponsors. And that relationship with patients, you know, I know we're here today talking about the benefits for our sponsors and CROs and the sites that we work with, but actually, you know, the relationship that patients build with the nurses allows for real life feedback. So if they just have one nurse, there's just one Teresa in front of me and I'm the only patient that she's got to see, I'm much more likely to start to open up whilst I've got undivided attention. That one-to-one that we spoke about in the previous slide that was on the screen for us, it allows me to be honest about symptoms and feedback on the IP that I've been taking or the medical device that I have been utilising as part of the clinical trial. And that all feeds back into that timely and accurate information that's able to be received by the sponsor and the site, which helps to give back, you know, it's good quality information that's coming through in that one-to-one perspective. And on top of that, you also have the oversight of the project management team, which has that extra level of check to make sure that the quality is maintained throughout when we've implemented one of these services. And it all again builds into patient satisfaction, and patient satisfaction builds into patient retention, and it builds a positive representation of clinical research out there. You know, we look at some of the countries that we operate in and you see an over-researched population, but the more patients that take part in research and have a positive experience, the more they can share that message. And there's, you know, we may potentially tap into a potential future participants by having that positive message sent from a satisfied individuals. And, you know, these trusting relationships and communication, it allows sponsors and sites to know which activities are being carried out and that we're complying with their needs, the needs of the protocol, all within accordance to GCP guidelines. Knowing that there is just a person at the end of the phone to deal with any issues. I know I've said it a million times today, but communication is key, along with that transparency from every single party to ensure that the study is being carried out as it should be, with the key personnel taking part. So some of the feedback that we've got, just to highlight the previous points that we've made, and hopefully the message that we've shared throughout the whole of this webinar today, is I'm not going to read these exact points that are on the screen, but again, to harp on about communication, it means that sponsors can feel abreast of everything that's happening during the study. That transparency makes that possible. It means there's a finger on the pulse of the activity, and sites and PIs feel like they are constantly be aware of what's happening to their patients that they're responsible for throughout a clinical trial. And then also knowing that that offer of home health is there, it means sponsors know that they're offering a current and modern solution for the running of their studies. And that's a flexible solution that takes into account the day-to-day challenges that we face in life, but as well as implementing life into research for all the parties involved.
And so, ultimately, the ultimate benefit for the sponsor organization is, I think, summed up in a pretty nice sentence that I heard at a recent conference, that the potential to improve recruitment, retention, and engagement, allowing for continuous data capture in real-world settings. We don't talk about cost. We know that those are hidden things embedded in all of those R's that I talked about, but it's the engagement and in a real world setting, because we're dealing with real patients with real needs and clinical sites with real needs. So the ability for decentralized clinical trial solutions, mobile nursing being one of those, being able to meet patients where the patient lives or works, that it's twofold. As we discussed in webinar 1, it supports the patient. In this webinar discussion, we talk about ways that it also supports sponsors and clinical study sites. So again, at Ren Nursing, we feel that it's a win-win situation for both parties. We thank you for your attention. And I think what we did, as in webinar 1, we had asked for a couple questions from some of the registrants ahead of time. And so I think I'll pass back over to Yasmin if you wanted to share a couple of those questions, and Danielle and I would be happy to try to answer them.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Danielle and Teresa, for running us through that content. I do have a few questions for you, which we can fit in the next few minutes. The first one is, what are the ideal specifications or qualifications of a home health nurse?
Thanks, Yasmin. I'll jump in, as I've spoken about communication being key. I might as well just keep talking. So when we're looking at the specifications for our home health nurses, there's key things around their nursing registration, and that obviously complying with the local area that they're going to be operating, as well as ensuring they are trained in GCP. There's other things around IATA training, dry ice handling samples training that nurses will need to have. But then there's those fundamental things as a home health nurse, and I'll look to Teresa as a fellow one of those. There's things that the nurses need to be able to do to carry out those activities. You need to be comfortable working as an autonomous practitioner. You need to be a confident practitioner to be able to work in a home health environment. There's the practical skills as well around phlebotomy, as well as cannulation and administering IV medications, and those competencies that exist as well. The usual mandatory training and life support training is also key. Teresa, have I missed anything there that you'd add?
No, and I think maybe to sum it up, Yasmin, that was a good question, and we certainly know that decentralized clinical trials are still nascent and without consistent standards across the board. But when a sponsor or the CRO is looking to partner with a potential mobile nursing organization, all of the things that Danielle described should be a part of the typical policy and standard operating procedures that mobile nursing services advertise for, and that everybody knows across any healthcare setting that consistent training, up-to-date training based on the latest evidence, following best practice guidelines, and certainly all nurses out there know that we have nursing standards of conduct, and clinical research nursing has its own professional standards that we hold ourselves to, Danielle and I, and also the nurses that we hire. And any mobile nursing service should also be doing the same. So sponsors and CROs should feel confident that when an agency is providing these specialty nurses to them, that they do come with appropriate and competent clinical nursing skills, but also have that research expertise.
Great, thanks, guys. We just have time for one more. So the second question is, how does your project management fit into my study?
I like that, my study.
Yeah, I like it. I think, I'm scared of saying the word communication again for fear of death from everybody, but I think the project manager is the key point of contact, and they are the key person, excuse me, to ensure the success of home health solutions being implemented. They're there to ensure that we've got the needs of the site and the sponsor completely understood and integrated with, and then transferring that knowledge back out to the nursing team. So they'll be responsible for the training of the nursing team, the potential working with the couriers to create shipment plans, making sure that they're trying to alleviate as much of those pressures from the sponsor and the site with the day-to-day running of the home health solution. So making sure that documentation is completed on time and uploaded in good quality, that shipments are tracked, shipments are delivered, that equipment is delivered and calibrated and maintained, that all of that documentation is ready at the drop of a hat to be shared, and ensuring compliance across the study as a whole whilst the home visits are taking place. Teresa, again, I'll hand over to you. I jumped in again.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I specifics and I don't know, I'm just being more of a generalist, I guess. But again, and I'll just respond additionally, going back to something Danielle said on one of the earlier slides, is that for us to support the trial, to incorporate our project management for the home nursing services as early as possible, we think, and it has worked, and Danielle has provided some really nice examples of how we actually can alleviate some of the stress and work from the project manager who at the sponsor agency or the contract research organization, by working with them early on and developing some hybrid solutions. So if patients coming into the clinical site for initial visits, and then they can be transitioned to home visits, the fact that the project manager can then I'm not saying transfer, but delegate or collaborate with our project management group to help facilitate those continued home visits that actually can alleviate some of the burden on the sponsor's project management or the CRO project management. So especially if we can work with those groups early on, I think that, again, using my win-win situations, that we know as much as we can up front so we can plan in advance for any possible needs, contingency planning and so forth, and also take some of that planning burden, if I would use the word lightly, that project managers at the sponsor or CRO level may encounter.
Great, thank you both for those answers, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today and discuss this topic. It's been good to share the information with you, and of course, if you have any questions, burning questions, please do send them over to us and we'd be happy to follow up with you via email. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to end the meeting, and we look forward to discussing the next webinar with you in a couple months' time. Thanks everyone. Thanks Danielle. Thanks Teresa.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.